Two of the top Jesus scholars in the nation have joined together to write The First Christmas, what the Gospel really teaches about Jesus' birth.
I spoke with Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg about how they came to write about The First Christmas.
Well, Dom and I had collaborated on an earlier volume about the last week of Jesus' life, Holy Week as it is known, as told by Mark's Gospel. And we enjoyed that collaboration so much that we decided it would be good to do a book about the beginning of Jesus' life as well. So The First Christmas came out of the last week.
Dom, the subtitle of the book is What the Gospels Really Teach Us About Jesus' Birth. What do you feel that those Gospels do indeed teach us?
Well, all four of the Gospels in the New Testament begin with an overture, but only two of them choose to make that overture by what we call a parabolic overture. In other words, Matthew and Luke each begin by giving a parable, not history, a parable about the birth of Jesus, which encapsulates or summarizes or synthesizes the gospel it is to follow in miniature. That's why Matthew and Luke are so different in their overture, because they are so different in their gospel.
You make the argument that to truly understand these stories, we must understand them not as fact or fable, but as parables and overtures. Why is that so important, Marcus?
Well, the model for understanding them as parables is the parables of Jesus. We all agree that Jesus made up those stories, and I don't know of anybody who is concerned to argue that there was really a good Samaritan or really a prodigal son and that Jesus was simply reporting out something that happened the other day. Parables, in a sentence, are about meaning, and the whole issue of factuality does not affect the truthfulness of a parable. Parables can be truth-filled even though they are not historically factual stories. So also we argue that the best way to understand the birth stories is always to ask the question, what do these stories mean, and not to get sidetracked by that sterile debate about whether they happened this way.
And you look at this through a historical approach of putting these into a first-century context, right, Dom?
Yes, and in a way that's embarrassingly obvious. Whenever anyone speaks anytime, you try to understand what they're saying in their own context. So we take these stories back into the first context, the first century context, and we find that the meaning is as relevant in the first century then as it is in the 21st century, and you don't really have to do huge, what on earth does it possibly mean for us? It is anti-imperial in the first century, still is, always will be.
So what questions come, using that perspective, what questions come out of that discussion? Marcus?
Well, to embroider or add to Dom's comment about their anti-imperial meaning, Herod the Great is appointed by Rome as king of the Jews, and of course it's Herod the Great who tries to kill the newborn Jesus. And in Luke's birth story, the language of Jesus as Son of God, conceived by a God, Lord, Savior, and the one who's brought peace on earth. All of that language is used in the first century, including the notion of a divine conception, about the Roman emperor. And so this is what leads to our statement that the birth stories are pervasively anti-imperial in their original setting. And then we would add that for American Christians today, among whom we include ourselves, the crucial question becomes, what does it mean for an American Christian in the time of the American Empire to celebrate Christmas as the story of the birth of one who stood against empire and was crucified by the empire of his time, and then, of course, vindicated by God at Easter. So it requires very serious consideration about, is the meaning of Christmas, among other things, that Christians are called to stand against the current imperial American foreign policy. This isn't about being anti-American, it's about being anti-imperial, because empires always seek to rule the world through victory and conquest. And the story of Jesus is really the opposite of that.
So, Dom, what questions does that leave us that we should be asking ourselves and ultimately change how we celebrate the holiday?
Well, continuing Marcus, the slogan, the mantra of the Roman Empire and of every empire that has ever existed is you get peace Empires always seek peace. That's what they always proclaim. Peace is our profession, they might say. They want to get it through victory, and that's really the bankrupt system of the last 6,000 years. You get peace, empires claim, through victory. The alternative message, and this is what is hopeful, extremely hopeful about the Christmas story, it says no. You don't get peace through victory. You get lull until the next round, and the next round is always more vicious than the last round. The way to get peace on earth, and that's what the Christmas message is about, that's what the angels come down to announce in Luke, it's about peace through justice. It's when everyone gets a fair share of God's earth as God's children, then you get peace. You will not get it through victory. So that's the good news of Christmas.
So that 6,000 years, why don't we learn from our mistakes?
It's a great question. I think it's because of, you might call it the primordial sin of empire. Empires intrinsically become filled with pride, with arrogance, with what the ancient Greeks called hubris. And this is being puffed up beyond appropriate size. And I see this as an intrinsic temptation of empire. It's even the temptation referred to in one of the temptation stories of Jesus. It is Satan who says, if you will fall down and worship me, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. And so the struggle of history is the struggle against the hubris and arrogance of domination systems and empires. And that struggle will continue to go on.
Dom, anything you'd like to add to that?
And what I would add to that is that the great news of Christmas is there is an alternative, because otherwise you could say, well, that's the way the world is. Get used to it. Get over your problems. It's not that we get peace through victory. It's the only way we can ever get it, since everyone wants it. We are doomed, as it were, to try for victory all the time. The message of Christmas is at least this: there is an alternative. There is peace through justice as an alternative, and that is the hope of the world.
Why did early chroniclers of Jesus' life, such as Mark and Paul, fail to include mention of an extraordinary birth?
I think the most obvious answer is that the stories of the birth of Jesus developed later. That Matthew and Luke, of course, are both written a decade or two after the Gospel of Mark, and as long as it's after Paul. And so I think the birth stories developed later than that.
Dom?
It's also one of the options. It's a standard option if you're writing after the life of some very, very famous person in the ancient world, and basically maybe nobody was watching that carefully when that person was born. So how do you explain the conception, the birth, the genealogy, even maybe the coming of age of such an extraordinary person? One of the standard ways of doing it is, quite frankly, to make up an extraordinary conception story. It was done by many ancient and important people, but the point that Marcus and I are making is that it is precisely in the first century the stories that were current, contemporary, about Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor. It is those stories that are, you might almost say, caricatured in the stories of Jesus' birth. They're not caricatured, of course, because they're being attacked. They are either low lampoon or high treason, to put it that way, and the Romans weren't laughing, so they got the message. It was treason.
Why did Jesus himself use parabolic language versus simply telling it straight?
The function of parable is to lure the audience into participation. If I give you a sermon, as it were, I've told you information, you can take it or leave it. The function of a parable is to tell you a story, say, about the Good Samaritan. And we shouldn't imagine it as the audience sitting quietly, politely, like a modern audience. They're probably interactive with Jesus, arguing back against him. No Samaritan would do that. Why are you always picking on priests and Levites? Don't be so anti-clerical. So it is to lure your audience into argument, participation, so that they have to make up their own mind about things. The whole function of a parable is to make you think.
I guess the parallels between the birth story of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and that of Moses in the book of Exodus, what are those parallels?
And that goes where we really saw most clearly the intention of Matthew. And when we determined that it wasn't really that he's trying to tell history and we're just so smart we won't believe it, when we began to realize that he's drawing a parallel between Jesus as the new Moses, and that's why Jesus is going to go up on what we call the Sermon on the Mount, up onto a new Mount Sinai to proclaim a radicalized Torah, actually, not a new one in the sense of the old one being gone, but a new one in the sense of the old renewed. And so when he comes to write the story of Jesus' conception and birth, all of a sudden Herod becomes the new Pharaoh. He's trying to kill all the children in order to kill Jesus, as Pharaoh had killed the children in order to kill Moses. So it's pretty obvious that he is playing a parallel between Herod and Pharaoh. But that's an extraordinary claim, because after all, the Israelites had fled for safety out of Egypt, and now that Herod and his Roman backers have taken over the Jewish homeland, Jesus flees into Egypt, away from the Jewish homeland. So it's been taken over by Pharaoh, as it were.
So ultimately, what do you hope people get out of your book, and what should the next step be for them?
Well, I think the first thing I would hope is that we could get over the argument, did it really happen? Was there a star? Was there a slaughter? Because the answer is, no, there wasn't. This is not history. This is parable. Get over it. Then, when you're looking at any parable, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, it ends with, go and do likewise. Parables are lures for action, decision. So I would hope at the end people might, instead of taking peace on earth out with the ornaments every Christmas and the trees, and at the end of the Christmas the ornaments go back into the attic or the basement and the trees go into the garbage, could we take peace on earth out of attic storage or garbage and really try and do something about it before it gets too late? Keep it out there. Don't tuck it away with the ornaments.
The name of the book is The First Christmas, What the Gospels Really Teach Us About Jesus' Birth. It is published by Harper. John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, thank you so much for spending time with us. I greatly appreciate it.
A pleasure to be with you, Joe. Thank you.
The name of the book is The First Christmas, What the Gospels Really Teach Us About Jesus' Birth.